good late afternoon to you all. I'm very honoured and privileged to be introducing a good friend of mine, who I think is one of the 2 or 3 most brilliant analysts of British politics, but who's also a very original thinker, breaking out of traditionals on the left, while at the same time honouring them and reinterpreting them to fit our very new circumstances. Talking to Maurice a few moments ago, he said, I won't use the word new because it's a very old word, and I would hesitate to use it myself, but I think we mean unprecedented, at least in recent generations, a comprehensive fragmentation of various aspects of the political world, and a breakdown of older traditions of left-wing thought as well as of right-wing thought, in which we all are faced with the possibly unpleasant and painful, certainly difficult, but I think rewarding task of thinking for ourselves, talking with other people with different views. Maurice and I don't agree on everything. We might have some differences on the nature of the state, but I think we both feel 2 things. One is that the traditions of the last 20 years of a certain kind of neoliberal progressivism, if they ever had any historical or moral validity, have been exhausted. And secondly, and this is more Maurice's territory than mine, that what we have now in all the major parties is the domination of a type of progressivism, which has very little to do with long-term historic left-wing traditions. And yet, it's the only thing that a whole generation of younger or middle-aged politicians and political activists know. And yet, thirdly, and perhaps finally, it's supremely unfitted to the conditions of the world in which we live. So they find themselves operating in a world which they don't understand. They make repeated mistakes, sometimes nearly catastrophic or almost unimaginable. So Maurice is going to address these issues today in the context of a larger, longer set of labour and left-wing traditions, and to argue, and it's something I'm sympathetic to myself strongly, that conservatism needs an input, if not of socialism, then at any rate of certain types of thinking, that classical or traditional socialism, Marxist even, and non-Marxist embodied. Thank you very much, Maurice.
Thank you, John, for your very generous words. But I think I should share that John was on my doctoral committee, so every time I see him, he sort of triggers a deep anxiety in me. So nice to see you. And I'm really honoured to be invited to speak here, and I'd like to thank Dan and Patrick and Nathan for doing all this. And comrades, I am also very grateful, because the distinctive English form of conservatism is to me one of the glories of the world. And without wanting to give the game away too quickly, until it was captured and decimated by the wild weeds of Trotskyist liberal free market fanatics in the name of Thatcherism, it understood important things about how to act in the world and about what the world was like. When I was growing up, you could, understand a conservative because the enigma of a curious silence was of a greater political virtue than an angry denunciation. And conservatives understood that there was primary matter alive in the world in terms of attachment, faith, nation, race, home, and it was necessary to accommodate those to the ever more complex task of self-government. So much of what is distinctive and good about our country is a result of the strength of conservatism. And conservatives viewed the world as a ship, and here I honour Michael Oakeshott very much, who really developed the ship of state as an analogy for politics, rather than a machine in which the primary task was to keep order on the deck, prevent mutiny, avoid getting captured, and navigate the capricious uncertainty of the sea. It really didn't matter where they were going. Conservatives were not sailing to the shores of socialism or liberty. They were just staying afloat, and that was hard enough. Thank you very much. Conservatives did not even acknowledge the existence of an ideological alternative. The assumption was to conserve as much as possible for as long as possible, given the conditions. This building is a beautiful example of conservatism, but you did note that there was a vaguely communist announcement before we started that emanated from nowhere. Yeah, so just to beware, nothing is sacred. And the judgment of those conditions was the art of politics. In 1895, the Marquis of Salisbury led the Conservative Party to a landslide election victory, almost as big as that of the Labour Party a few weeks ago, on the public position, and I quote, because it's astonishing, that as change is invariably for the worst, I intend to do as little as possible. It is sometimes hard not to yearn for better days. It is interesting to note that Clement Attlee unhesitatingly described Salisbury as the greatest Prime Minister, citing the establishment of the London County Council, the first London-wide institution in 1899, and the building of council housing through the Working Class Housing Bill. Even the bills had better names in those days. The Working Class Housing Bill that built the most durable and beautiful estates that we have ever seen. Balconies, brick, high windows, and indoor toilets included. They now sell for millions of pounds in London, but they were built as an inheritance for the poor, a metaphor perhaps for the fate of conservatism. He was, of course, that is Salisbury, denounced by the Guardian, the Manchester Guardian, as a state socialist pure and simple. Salisbury's response is relevant to our talk tonight. He said, "Do not imagine that by merely affixing to it the reproach of socialism, you can seriously affect the progress of any great legislative movement or destroy those high arguments which are derived from the noblest principles of philanthropy and religion." And the bill was passed. Restoration rather than reform was the conservative approach. Self-governing corporate bodies were preferred to state-directed departments. The ship of state preferred the navy to the army for obvious reasons. Guns were things to be used abroad, not at home. Civic peace was considered the greatest political virtue of them all. Maybe John Willie Whitelaw was the last great conservative politician whose campaigning style was to go around the country whipping up apathy. So I am grateful to the conservative tradition. I am inspired by it and I study it. But this is also a story of friendship. When I was last in this theatre, I was participating in the Roger Scruton Memorial Lectures, and I assumed conservatively that this was still the case. Imagine my surprise when I checked nervously when the lecture was. I thought I'd missed it, and it was the Oakeshott Lectures. I honour Michael Oakeshott very much. So I decided that this was of no significance, because Roger Scruton was a real friend of mine, and in many ways this talk is a public airing of a conversation we had over several years on Tuesday evenings in his flat in Albany. It was Roger who taught me that nostalgia was not an accusation to be refuted, but a fate to be embraced. Nostos means a longing for hope, and the very essence of a meaningful politics is to retrieve a sense of home from the dehumanizing forces of the market and the state. In the final sentence of his final interview with Giles Fraser, Roger said that Blue Labour is more in keeping with my line of thinking than most of what goes on in the Conservative Party. This afternoon I will try to explain why he would say such a thing. In our final conversation, when he was very ill, I asked him why he said that, and he replied, "Maurice," I can't do his voice, "Maurice, conservatism is not a party political thing. There used to be two conservative parties, and now there is not one. You must try harder." A few days later, he was dead, and I miss him terribly. He died just when a cloud no bigger than a man's hand appeared over Wuhan, and the COVID apocalypse descended. My first instinct was to go and talk to him about it, but all I heard was silence. I miss him still and wish to say that our entire polity is the worse for his passing. May his name and his memory be blessed, and those who reviled and denounced him should always be treated with contempt. I could say more, believe me, and I would like to, believe me, more, but it is important to move along with the central argument that I'm making tonight, which is that only socialism can redeem conservatism. That conservatism, as John mentioned, has been almost entirely captured by a form of revolutionary liberalism that is hostile to a stable form of life. This takes the form of finance capitalism and has left both the Conservative Party and our country in a palsied and perilous state. That the genius of conservatism was precisely its understanding that tradition was a condition of modernisation, that solidarity was more important than liquidity, that society requires a sense of the sacred if it is to flourish, that sacrifice was as important as choice, that the monarchy means more than the market, that meaning was more important than choice. So I guess this is the right moment to introduce the basic ideas of Blue Labour, which champions each of these commitments before I move on to the ruins of contemporary conservatism. So Blue Labour was born during the, if anybody can remember this, during the financial crash of 2008 and the dismal twilight of New Labour and the Third Way. It was also the time of my mother's death. She had a terrible condition called progressive supranuclear palsy, and I saw her become a mute witness to her own degeneration. The only good thing about that was that it inoculated me to progressivism. It is indeed the last thing you want to hear when you go to the doctor. It's progressive. And these two things came together in Blue Labour as I tried to make sense of the loss of both my mum and of the Labour tradition. Its uncritical embrace of globalization, the domination of finance capital combined with a pitiless progressive modernism left no place for workers in the movement they had created. It was a case study in alienation and dispossession. My mum left school at 13 to work in a factory so she could support her 4 younger sisters and her ill father, who died a few months before I was born. My love for Labour came from her. She told me how they built the National Health Service, how Hackney Council moved her family from a damp basement to a council flat, that they led the fight against Hitler, and the thing I didn't really share with her so much, and that they shared her fanatical commitment to education. The United Synagogue, Tottenham Hotspur Football Club and the Labour Party were the objects of what Edmund Burke might call instinctive sympathy. I had no idea as a child that fidelity to orthodoxy, Spurs and Labour would define the tragedy of my life. As my mum lost her capacity of speech, all I could do was watch television with her. We stared at the unfolding financial meltdown as the combined assets of many generations. Trying to remember Northern Rock. I mean, this was a mutual that had existed for 150 years in the northeast that was just disintegrated overnight. And as we watched Gordon Brown saying that it was the destiny of Labour to save the global banking system, my mum's eyes met mine for the final time, and then she shook her head and closed her eyes. That was when Blue Labour was born, and it turned out to be a river with many currents running through it. Some of them are philosophical and find their source in Aristotle and what is now called virtue ethics, taking in Aquinas and Alistair MacIntyre along the way. Some are Christian, ranging from the dissenting tradition based on association, liberty and conscience, through that of Catholic social thought, and its critique of capitalism based upon the dignity of labour, local democracy, solidarity and the stewardship of nature. These in turn were rooted within a biblical tradition, which first articulated that human beings and nature were sacred and not simply resources for the accumulation of power and money. Pharaoh turned out to be a contemporary reality, from Amazon to China, and we thought that mercy, kindness, righteousness and justice were necessary to resist domination. While Blue Labour expanded and the conversations intensified, that there was a shared recognition that all of these things were embodied in a Labour tradition, and their recovery was essential for its renewal. Well, it soon became clear that any politics that could draw inspiration from the Pilgrimage of Grace and the Putney debates, from Archbishop Laud and Thomas Winstanley, from Saul Alinsky and Ernest Bevin, from Edmund Burke and Karl Polanyi, it was not going to find a home in a movement dominated by Whiggish assumptions. The roots of Labour lay in its covenantal bond with the British working class. The culture and experience of workers shaped the form of the Labour movement. It was of them, by them, and for them, and that clearly was and is no longer the case. The steady disaffection of the working class from their party was the source of its progressive palsy. Nothing has changed. When you win a general election with less than 34% of the vote and gain 71% of the seats in Parliament, it is more reminiscent of the Soviet Union under Brezhnev than of a renewal of social democracy. Blue Labour began as a recognition of sadness and the demoralisation that had fallen upon the party, movement and tradition by 2008. It was compromised, lacking in vitality, and severed from the root of its renewal, relationally and conceptually. Of all the sentences that have ever been said in politics, the least true is this: things can only get better. Okay? Just think about that at every single level. It's really, really wicked in its stupidity and its assumptions. So I share that with you as a preamble to what comes next, because that, after all, was the slogan of our party in 1997, and to my horror, it happened again this year. When I was at Labour Party conference, suddenly things can only get better was beamed out. So I just draw that to your attention. And the inability, what's the problem with that sentence, is the lack of understanding of loss and tragedy, which is absolutely necessary for political wisdom. So what are the truths that Blue Labour holds? The first is that human beings are not commodities, that they're not created to be bought and sold, but there's something sacred about the human being, and we are also creative and social beings longing for connection and meaning. The second is that nature is not a commodity either, but a condition of life and a sacred inheritance. When Blue Labour started, I used to get invited to Labour constituency parties, and they'd give me a very bad time for working so closely with the Catholic Church, with various churches, with mosques, because they were patriarchal, they were sexually abusive and all these things. And I used to say, well, at least people of faith don't think the free market created the world, And, it's still the argument momentarily. The Labour tradition also asserted that democracy is the best way to resist the domination of the rich and the educated, and that the leadership and participation of the working class was central to this. Further, that local democracy is vital, as well as forms of economic democracy that can hold state and market powers to account. In other words, a democracy locational and vocational. More than that, Labour drew upon a historical memory and not only rational argument. It drew upon the Norman yoke and the tradition of the freeborn for the solidarity required by its associations. It not only demanded a human status for labour, but a move from the contractual to the covenantal. The human status of labour required the binding of capital to reciprocal obligations, the strengthening and not the abolition of the inherited institutions such as Parliament and the common law, and the restoration of the ancient constitution. Labour was rooted in class, but it was a national party, and its internationalism was rooted in an idea of democratic nation states, in which sovereignty was required in order to domesticate capital. I argued during the Brexit referendum that Brexit was absolutely continuous with the Labour tradition, and there weren't that many followers in that regard. Within the Labour tradition, the liberties are held to be sacrosanct, and there were four fundamental forms: freedom of religion, in which no one could be coerced in their faith; freedom of conscience, no one could be coerced in their beliefs; freedom of expression, in that people were free to speak, create, were free to reject and criticise; and freedom of association, which was the fundamental form of the trade union movement, which was banned for a century before it was accepted. For Blue Labour, liberty and democracy are not opposed, but mutually supportive political practices. It was also born of a recognition that any vital political tradition and movement has to go beyond rational philosophy and embrace paradox, to combine seemingly contradictory elements in new forms. So one of the paradoxes would be the old is the new, or the tradition will shape modernity, these things. But Labour is a paradoxical tradition, far richer than its present form of economic utilitarianism and legal progressivism. The Labour tradition is not best understood for students here, and I send mercy and love, who are studying PPE. It is not the living embodiment of the liberal communitarian debate or a variant of European Marxist social democratic tension. It is both robustly national and international, conservative and egalitarian, Christian and secular, Catholic and Protestant, Republican and monarchical, democratic and elitist, radical and traditional. It is at its most transformative and effective when it defies the status quo in the name of ancient as well as modern values. The Labour tradition has a vast and varied assortment of traditions, stories and accomplishments, and yet the technical managerialism of its dominant ideology cannot draw upon its history for its renewal. This is their weakness, and this is our strength. This type of political tradition is to be distinguished from matters of philosophy. Philosophical arguments like policy proposals aspire to be universal, coherent and reasonable. Such demands may, and I repeat, may be useful at the final stages of a policy review, when specific recommendations have to be ordered but are unsuited to either political action or ethics. Historical continuity, democracy, the necessity of extemporized action, and the demands of leadership render politics contingent, comparative, and paradoxical in form. Ideas are not ultimate and singular in politics, but contested and related. The English nation, above all, is deeply synthetic in form, constituted by different tribes and people, and they generated an unprecedented form of common law, common language, and the inheritance of a commonwealth. Its political parties and movements have been stubbornly synthetic too, a matter of blending folk and academic concerns through a politics of interests. Political movements which are rooted in the lives and experiences of people bring together new constellations of existing political matter. What to philosophers is an incoherence can be a source of vitality and strength to a political tradition which contests with others for democratic power over its vision of the common good. So I would argue, just to carry on with this, that two ancient political traditions came together in the Labour movement. You could almost call them our ancestors. On one side was the Aristotelian notion of the common good and the good life, and in this, the importance of politics, of virtue, understood as a common life between estranged interests, were carried into the political life of the nation. And the founders of the Labour movement understood the logic of capitalism as based on the maximisation of returns on investment at the greatest possible speed and the threat this posed to their lives, livelihoods and their environment. But they did not embrace class war and clung stubbornly to the idea of a common life with their rulers and exploiters, and the democratic renewal of their inherited institutions. The Labour idea of the person, in which the plural institutions of civic life have a vital effect on the flourishing of the individual and are inseparable from it, are explicitly Aristotelian and conservative. So this is an important root of the conservatism in the Labour tradition, a concern with the preservation of status, limits on the market, and attachment to place, starting with the common sense of people rather than with external values and a strong commitment to a common life. This is also a direct link to the Tudor statecraft tradition of the 16th century, which was also self-consciously Aristotelian, which engaged with the balance of interest within the realm rather than the separation of powers, pioneering endowment to promote the sciences and commerce. This is the origin of the Oxford colleges, developing apprenticeships and slowing enclosures. The Commonwealth men, and I don't want to be too sectarian, but sometimes they were known as the Balliol Commonwealth men of the early 20th century, of which G.D.H. Cole and R.H. Tawney were active participants, are part of that tradition. Oxford University was once a rich resource of conservative socialism, but now it is quiet as a cemetery at night, or a haunted graveyard, maybe. The second ancestral tradition within which Labour was embedded is that which followed the Norman conquest and actively pursued the idea of the balance of power within the ancient constitution and the rights of freeborn Englishmen. It was on the basis of the violation of customary practice that they resisted the subsequent enclosures and assertion of royal prerogative in the name of Parliament and the liberties threatened by the domination of one institution alone. So Labour just takes its place in a far longer national tradition of resistance that values a democratic order that is both reforming and traditional in simultaneous motion. Parliamentary socialism, the national commonwealth, whichever way Labour chose to describe itself in its first 50 years, it always acknowledged its attachment to the language and sensibility of the politics of the Commonwealth and a central role for the inherited institutions of governance that represented the interests of what used to be known as the Commons, and the House of Commons not being the least of these. So it is far too rarely acknowledged that alone in Europe, Labour succeeded in generating a workers' movement that was not divided between Catholic and Protestant, or between secularists and believers, but the movement itself provided the common life within which these potentially antagonistic forces could combine in a pursuit of the common good. In cities like Glasgow and Liverpool, as well as London and Birmingham, this was an extraordinary achievement. This is perhaps the most distinctive feature of the Labour tradition, as opposed to social democracy in Europe, which was far more explicitly secularist in form. The non-established churches, Catholic and Protestant, for reasons of historical self-interest, were committed to freedom of association and expression. The churches which nurtured the Labour movement were associational forms of religious solidarity, severed from state power and concerned with preserving a status for the person that was not defined by money or by power alone. Aristotelianism flowed predominantly through the Catholic Church, the right of freeborn Englishmen through the Protestant congregations of the South and the Midlands, and they came together in the Labour movement, which was committed to religious freedom. It was literally a broad church. The London dock strike of 1889 is a classic expression of the Labour movement in action, built on the assumption that only organised people could resist exploitation, and the forging of an alliance between Irish and local workers brokered by the Catholic Church and the Salvation Army. If you read the account of the times of the dock strike, the horror of the times was that a Protestant should be walking or involved in politics with a Catholic. We forget these things, but that was the sense of outrage that they had. And I could go on, you see, but I'm going to have mercy on your soul while I extol the birth of the Labour movement. The sheer ferocity of the market storm within which Labour was born in the 19th century, the scale of the dispossession of property, status and assets generated by the creation of the first ever free market in labour and land, the simultaneous enclosure of the common lands, the criminalisation of association, the scrapping of apprenticeships, and the eviction and proletarianisation of the peasantry meant that the only port of storm was the security that people found in each other. The burial given by the cooperative society is another example of the retrieval of status generated by the labour movement, the dignity of death given by solidarity in life. For those who were enclosed and moved to the industrial towns, the pauper's grave was their fate. It was a combination of subs paying membership, cooperation with chapels and churches, and the practices of mutuality and reciprocity that provided the resources out of which a human status for the person could be retrieved. Reverence for life, the honour given to each member through their membership and dues, were not drawn from a secular or modernist ethic, but a radical solution was fashioned from traditional assumptions and practices. Labour as a radical tradition was crafted by both workers and Christian institutions as they confronted the hostility of an exclusivist state and an avaricious market. They called their ideology socialism and their party Labour, and I remained faithful to their memory. So the Labour tradition was distinctive in that it resisted the domination of the poor by the rich, asserted the necessity of the liberties of expression, religion and association, and made strong claims for democratic authority and sovereignty. It did this within a democratic politics of the common good, resisted violence and strengthened democracy. The obvious conclusion is that it might be a good idea to do this again, but that's my day job. What is obvious is that we are entering an era, a change of era. Pope Francis said that we're not living through an era of change, but a change of era. And we are moving from the era of globalization to what I tentatively call an era of restoration. And I date the era of globalization, which we are now emerging from, as beginning with the election of Margaret Thatcher's government in 1979. The era of globalization was based on the idea of change without continuity, of a modernity without tradition. The consequences were viewed as a fate, in which alternatives were considered nostalgic, populist, or doomed. As technology knew no borders, as stable employment evaporated into transferable skills, enormous changes were embraced as necessary. Immigration, for example, was viewed as a fate outside of political negotiation. Universities were expanded, house prices surged, manufacturing was replaced by, do you remember, John, the knowledge economy? Do you remember this one? Real physical presence was replaced by virtual reality, the relationship and constraints of community replaced by self-defined identity. Choice was elevated as the ultimate freedom, even as it was entirely constrained by technology, markets, and law. And yet none of this was true. Traditions were subdued but not eviscerated. The realities of an embodied and embedded life upon the earth were lived and shared between people. Love endured through the disenchantment, and democracy was not entirely subordinated to procedure. The interests of those who benefited most from the new arrangements, the rich and the educated, articulated their interests in terms of universal values and historical inevitability, personified by that word, progress. Okay, that's the telos of all of this. The values were those of aspiration, mobility, openness, in opposition to the nasty interests of place and work, and any resistance was characterized by reactionary, closed and doomed. The captivation of labour by what might be called, and is probably called in several places within this city, capitalist modernity or liquid modernity, meant that it could not articulate or pursue any form of resistance to its acceleration. The categories of labour, land and money were rendered outside of political contestation, and each was defined as a commodity. It's only 20 to 6, so I'm reluctant to use this word before 8. But it's just, this is the essence of it all, is commodification. It's this process by which things that are not produced for sale, human beings, nature, and even money which is produced by the state, are relentlessly turned into commodities to be bought on the price system, subject to variable prices. So that's the difference between a market economy and a market society, when commodification is the way that you care for your parents, care for your children, where it penetrates into the very basis of human life and relationship. And as the categories of labour, land and money were rendered outside of political contestation and defined as commodity, these were the assumptions that were also to destroy conservatism in an even more profound way. Underpinning all this is the idea of revolution, that the era we were entering into was unprecedentedly different. This was foolish in two ways. The first is that there is always, and this you would learn from Burke, this you would learn from Hume, this is the starting point of conservatism. There is always a continuity through time, but the very idea of revolution is a defiance of the persistence of matter and memory, and renders itself blind to its continuities. So it is not simply that revolution is wrong, which it is that it is also impossible and a fantasy. The second is that it renders the experiences of the past inaccessible and impermissible. Thus, Tsarist imperialism could not be linked to Soviet policy, nor Napoleon to the French kings. And Nick, I really welcome you here and extend Nick is from Odessa in Ukraine. I wish to say now my complete solidarity with your city and with your country. But people could not be publicly discussed that the Soviet Union was an absolute continuity of Tsarist Russification. That was rendered impossible to see because it was a revolution and it was nothing, as I was told all the time when I was at university, the Soviet Union is the only country that doesn't have a place in its title. This was just progress, guys, when in fact it was something else entirely. So it is an unremarked irony that the Conservative Party was the agent of revolution. And it is a matter of tragicomedy that it is still stranded in its delusions. It's almost painful to say these words, but I'll do it. With Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick arguing with each other about which is the best Thatcher tribute act. It's a really pathetic state for a great political tradition to be in. And my party, in the form of New Labour, took a revolutionary approach to itself. As I've mentioned, the Labour movement was a curious thing, an amalgam of displaced workers, religious traditions, and they kept that language. But for us too, they confused, we have a long tradition of distinguishing between globalization and internationalism, but globalization became internationalism. For those of us who lived through the Brexit referendum, you've got to look at the EU as the greatest capitalist institution the world has ever known. It's an unremitting machine of commodification and free markets. And yet I was told that this was an expression of Labour international solidarity. So bonkers. So that's what you get when you think that things can only get better isn't actually a true sentence. So one way of understanding what went on here is that in the pantheon of the Greek gods, Apollo and Hermes represent two very different types of people and peoples. Apollo was rooted in place and represented stability and honour, agriculture and war. Hermes, in contrast, was swift and mobile with a delight in trickery in music and literature. They were both quick to see each other's vices. For Apollonians, Mercurians were cunning, lacking in courage, while valuing money and success over reliability and faithfulness. Likewise, the Mercurians considered the Apollonians slow, stupid, and provincial. Both groups have coexisted in society since ancient times, Apollonians dominating the countryside and Mercurians flourishing in the city. In the development of the British polity, this tension between the court and the country, the city and the countryside, London and the provinces, became characteristic of its politics, and both forms of life, the settled and the transient, the durable and the fleeting, the productive and the commercial, the crafts and the arts, needed each other. The tension between them constituted the distinctive character of our polity, which was characterized by a very distinctively extreme form of tradition and modernity, conservatism and radicalism, continuity and change. The pioneer of industrialization and the home of globalized finance capital also preserved the monarchy, parliament, common law and the established church. This was the mighty achievement of conservatism. It was conservatism that restored the ancient constitution, doubled down on the monarchy, church and parliament, while establishing public parks, extending grammar schools and placing limits on the market. And our politics was in large part a negotiation between these groups. The Mercurians offered ever-expanding horizons and wealth on their terms. Come and work in the city. The Apollonians were wary of the offer, fearing the loss and insecurity this would bring. The relationship between progress and dispossession and the rate of change were publicly negotiated. A settlement would come unstuck if the balance of power tilted too much towards the Mercurians, although the direction of travel was clear. And this was where the Tories became the dominant political formation. They kept the City of London within its walls. Now, what is distinctive, and I say this to most people here now, because this is the world that we grew up in, what is distinctive about the past 40 years, this era of liberal globalization, is that it claims not only that all virtues are held by Hermes, that the battle is to the swift, the mobile and the qualified, but that it breaks any notion of mutual dependency with the Apollonians. And this disdain is now the politics that we have, and it was reciprocated. The Apollonians became, in the only line of poetry from Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign, a basket of deplorables. The places in which they lived, reservations for the losers and the left behind, those unable to change and embrace the possibilities opened up by an increasingly mercurial world. I've got a great quote from Tony Blair, but I'm running out of time, and I think you can be spared. He basically says, get on with it. And his words are exactly paralleled by another quote by President Xi of China, and this is where I view the Maoist element in the New Labour project was just a rejection of all tradition and an embrace of a brutal competition. And Margaret Thatcher described New Labour as her greatest achievement. This is of significance too. So my argument is that what we are going through now in our politics is an interregnum. Nothing is resolved. It's a time in between times when the consensus, the previously united parties, there was no serious difference between Thatcher, Blair, Cameron, Osborne, and the subsequent governments that we've had, is that consensus, the previously united parties, are now being publicly contested. Such a period, and it feels like that, is an argument over sanity, over the limits and meaning of what it is reasonable to believe and do. This era of globalization still persists, particularly among our elites. The increasing economic power of China and the internet platforms intensified, but there is no constructive alternative to replace it. Hedge funds are a post-modern form of enclosure. Antonio Gramsci described an interregnum as a time, quote, when the old is dead and the new cannot be born, when there is a fraternization of opposites and all manner of morbid symptoms pertain. This is our present moment. And the new, what is coming, takes on a monstrous form in which we are besieged by populists and authoritarians who offer democracy of all things as a form of resistance to a globalized economic order that has no place for any form of power that protects the interests of working people. In such a period, the new is perceived as mad, bad, and dangerous, an unreasonable spectre from the past that indicates a dystopian future. It is threatening and destabilizing to the self as well as the polity. Anybody who's worked in a new university understands that people consider themselves going through trauma, when it used to be called kind of a bit behind with your reading. The intensification of the prescription of opiates and other forms of legal antidepressants and painkillers has become one of the central features of this interregnum. It is a time of betrayal, confusion, anxiety, and moral panic. I subscribe, by the way, so that you know a few things about me, to the Daily Mail to get my daily fix of this. It is so exhausting. Sometimes I have to go straight back to bed after I've read it. You know, the world has gone completely mad. And So the market storm is accompanied by political turmoil and the questioning of the most fundamental institutions of political order. The election of July the 4th of this year was the worst result for the Conservative Party since 1832, and I see no signs of resurrection. So it's completely disconnected. Now, there's very, very, very boring bit here, but I think you don't really have to hear it. It's about globalization. So I'll move to the concluding argument. I think you now know what Blue Labour is about. I think you now know what the era of globalization is about, although I go into further detail. The fundamental argument is that capitalism treats human beings and nature as commodities, fungible objects to be moved around, exploited and discarded on the basis of maximum returns on investment at the greatest possible speed. Its distinctive feature is that the very substance of society is turned into a market, with fluctuating prices setting the value of human beings, land and food. This is what I referred to earlier as a market society. It is unsustainable as the organising principle of society, leading to human and ecological degradation, powerlessness and inequality. This is what conservatives understood. This is what Salisbury understood, and no conservative leader since Thatcher has been able to articulate. The Conservatives led Brexit, but had no idea what to do with it, and its possibilities remain unfulfilled. We have not made the move from member state to nation state. The intermediate institutions are still subordinated to centralised control in the name of procedural justice. It is mistaken to assume that capitalism works alone. It is in all cases in partnership with the Leviathan or state, which creates the conditions of the enforcement of a contractual society. John Hobbes, it's just fundamental. So member statism is a form of domination in which political sovereignty loses its democratic nature and takes on a primarily administrative form. As the state defines politics as a technocratic redistribution of resources, rather than a mutual space of negotiation for the creation of a common good, there is little reciprocity or accountability in the model. Without a democratic society to hold it in check and challenge its centralizing authority, it can and has become a form of domination that undermines liberty and pluralism. In other words, the body politic is eliminated. In contrast, the argument developed here is that a common life is capable of being negotiated, and that is the essence of politics. For example, immigration is a political issue which was hived off into the legal and constitutional order. Free movement is not an uncontestable right, and legal rights are always a political achievement and require the consent of a political community. They can be lost, and their maintenance requires strong democratic support. This basic truth was lost in the period of liberal globalization, when legitimate political concerns about immigration, as well as regional or industrial policy, are often considered illegal. In this globalized world, based on capitalism, the administrative state, and a liberal constitution, a sense of belonging, of place, of work, of mutuality and responsibility are undermined through a lack of power. The very basis of conservative thought is liquidated. The point of democratic politics is to shape and preserve a home in the world against the threats of domination and dispossession, and to maintain the structure of society in the face of intense forces of integration. This is the fundamental reason why only socialism can redeem conservatism, because conservatism has proven to have no immunity to the logic of capitalism, in which all that is solid melts into air and everything holy is profaned. To quote Marx. Okay. So Brexit was a symptom, not a cause, of the present interregnum. And this present Labour government continues to be unable to distinguish between internationalism and globalisation, and it will appear quickly to be a force that maintains a bankrupt settlement. We still cannot think creatively about the democratic renewal of inherited political and civic institutions, such as the City of London or City and Guilds, but think of their abolition, as they're now thinking of abolishing the hereditary peers. Institutional diversity is subordinated to procedural uniformity. Labour cannot offer respite from the demands of an unconstrained global order and the precarious powerlessness it generates. But here we come to the heart of the matter. Neither can Conservatives. Do you remember Boris Johnson? Anybody remember Boris Johnson? Do you remember the 2019 election? Do you remember the scale of that majority? And it was all about a new economic settlement of levelling up. And as they say in Italian, nothing happened. We had 4 years of nothing happening. Conservatives could not move into the space opened up by Brexit, and that was because they loved capitalism more than the ancient constitution. The sight of Liz Truss giving the eulogy to Her Majesty the Queen at her funeral was a symbolic expression of a far deeper malaise. The glory of Her Majesty being lauded by someone so trivial was painful to watch. The Conservative Party was born in opposition to the repeal of the Corn Laws. It invented municipal socialism, clean water in the cities, and an affordable railway system. It defied the logic of the free market in human beings and nature through the elevation of covenantal institutions such as the monarchy, the church, and the armed forces. Conservatism successfully defeated Nazism, republicanism, and communism, and yet it proved incapable of resisting liberalism. It has lost its sense of the sacred, of tradition, of nation. And while I believe that only socialism can redeem conservatism, because only socialism has an understanding of the revolutionary disintegration generated by commodification, it is equally true that only conservatism can redeem socialism. But that, I fear, is a different lecture entirely. So thank you very much.
I hope you are all as intellectually stirred and enriched in your thoughts by that extremely intriguing and creative and original talk. It imposes on me a rather unusual task, which I haven't had for many, many years, of perhaps wanting to speak up for non-socialist conservatism. I think Maurice is absolutely right that, and I want to ask him about this in a moment, that conservatism was, as one of the unintended consequences of Margaret Thatcher, lost many of its most essential elements of respect for community, for the sacred, for bonds that weren't only bonds of the market and so on. I think that was true. But the odd thing about it is that unlike her successors, she was aware of it. Do any of you remember when she objected to the privatization of the post office?
I remember that.
It's unthinkable, she said, unthinkable. She said, why, Prime Minister? Because the Queen's head is on the stamps. She was aware of that contradiction. A lesser known episode occurred when she was flying somewhere and she noticed on British Airways jet that they'd taken off the Union Jack at the back end of the plane. So she went round and demanded to have something put to cover this horrible business logo by something more traditional and more national. So Margaret Thatcher was a creature of contradictions. She didn't theorize all this, but she saw that there was more to what conservatism was than, and this will lead me to my first question, than the market, more than individualism, more than choice. And some of these other things might actually be in tension or even contradiction with choice and with the market. So my question to you, Maurice, is, as a man of the left, when did this and how did this evisceration of traditional thinking about politics and society start on the left? Because the first thought that went through my mind when you were talking about it is that if you read back into the early 19th century, there were traditions of technocratic managerialism in people like Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells and the Fabians, that were not market-oriented at all. They didn't think of humans as commodities. They thought of humans as matter, raw matter to be remoulded, not as commodities. It never mentioned the market except negatively. So when did it happen? Was it with Blair? Was it as late as that, or was it earlier on?
Earlier on, lots of things. Right, I mean, just one further thing about Thatcherism that I think that we now understand that was completely went on behind her back, which was she very, very self-consciously understood herself as resisting Soviet communism.
Absolutely.
That was a huge, but
That was the first reason I supported her and the very first reason I met her. It was not actually pro-capitalism, it was anti-communism.
Yeah, I remember. And I remember your Hayekian period too, John, which we can talk about.
Yes. He was anti-communist as well.
Yeah. So am I. Okay. This is the point I'm making, is that what we didn't see, no one saw, was that she would completely empower the Chinese Communist Party. This was the meaning of it all in the end. That the inherited capital generated by industrialization was transferred almost its entirety to the Chinese Communist Party.
Something in that, yeah.
That they have now become an incredibly powerful industrial force. This is what I'm saying, is that she thought that industrialization didn't matter, but capital didn't think that. Capital invested in industrial productivity, but in a place where there were no... So she was anti-communist, but she was also unbelievably hostile to trade unions.
She was.
And this is the point I'm making, is that in China, really, communists have never mucked around with free and democratic trade unions. You've got 24-hour-a-day production, absolutely assured, 24-hour-a-day without disruption. I mean, I'm in touch with the distant Chinese trade unions. I've only got their words for it. But they assure me that, you know, there's 50 people killed a week in China in industrial action. Right? So, in fact, the meaning of Thatcherism is the strengthening of Chinese communism. That's the ultimate meaning. So I just wanted to bring that in.
And she didn't live long enough to hear that. But
yeah.
I
had a recent discussion with Charles Moore, who's her biographer, and when I said that I was kind of tempted to bring a treason trial against Thatcher for this, he took it quite badly, but we managed to, in the name of the common good, we managed to overcome that. Okay, so today I was talking to you, and very, very self-consciously, about conservatism. I was trying to say that and in fact it goes back to Burke, right? That, look, European continental conservatism is a completely different beast. Really quite weird and ugly in lots of ways. And but the English conservatism was so vocal, and yet even Burke could not see the genie, the dark genie in the bottle. He couldn't see the disintegration and the revolutionary power of capital, property-owning democracies, that this would be eviscerated, that the small farmers would be bought out. Nick, I see this process going on in Ukraine, and that there's really self-sufficient farmsteads, but BlackRock is moving in and will buy them up and turn them into industrial agricultural production. So this is the thing, but English conservatism held its position for 140 years of being quite skeptical of markets, of being prepared to act and restoring civic institutions, in fact innovating in quite drastic ways to create new institutions in the guise of the old. So today I was talking to you about that, but I can assure you that if I'm talking to more progressive or left-wing people, then I talk always about the way that the administrative state eroded association. So all the things I'm talking about which I kind of mentioned with the trade unions, with the co-op burial societies, but gradually all of this was nationalised and disintegrated. So really that starts in 45, John?
I was just thinking,
Yeah.
yours is a much subtler and I think much more profound an argument than contrasting old and new Labour.
No, but the origins of that...
Old Labour was statist in your views, or a lot of it was.
Acne wasn't, Bevan wasn't, but the government was. It's a complicated argument in that regard. They still lurked around association and tried to build things around the principle of association with state partnership, but as you can see, that disintegrated. So by the 1960s, it was in full retreat, managerialism, white hot heat, state power.
So Wilson was part of the retreat, you think?
Yeah, certainly, and then what it was that there was a Labour political economy in its original forms that I was talking about was decentralised and associational. But then what you had is you had the Soviet Union, you had the Second World War, and then you had the nationalisation model. But that became... Now, when it was revealed that the nationalisation model was objectively and in so many ways inferior to the market model, essentially what you got was the retreat of the Labour tradition for many matters of political economy, so it became a welfare party. And then as it became a welfare party, then you get the nightmare of the micromanagement of individual families, to read to their children at night, and the idea that the state could transform. My argument is that it should never have. Human beings in nature are not a commodity, that you have to understand. And industrial, this is the key point. So John mentioned in the introduction, and I'm telling you now, that the order of the world that we're moving into, and this is relating to the point I made about China, is that China is powerful because it is industrial. It has industrial power. We, at the moment, my day job is just about arguing for industrial strategy, renewal of the armed forces, weapons, that this is the world we're moving into. But essentially, Thatcher let go of the industrial production. Labour then moved into a progressive dream of a global knowledge economy in which universities will play the role of providing the new global leadership.
And no one knows anything.
No one, it's just that they don't know anything.
The key thing about the knowledge class is 80% of it doesn't know anything about anything.
It's that they can't actually do anything. They don't know how to do any. Like, one of the glories of going to Ukraine is that they've still got an active industrial working class that actually builds things. And it's like a shocking wonderment to behold. But this is, so the old is the new. So my argument is retreat from the nationalisation. 45 was the original sin. Nationalisation replaced the decentralised form of co-determination and various other forms of municipal production. Then you get the retreat from industrial production, the hostility. You end up with Margaret Thatcher absolutely empowering the Communist Party of China. And guys, this is the world you live in. Okay, this is where we are now. And we have to, well, we can go on, but I think it's, unless this government finds a way of restoring both our armed forces and our industry, it will go the way of the previous Conservative government. And then I would then predict under those circumstances that Reform would be perhaps the biggest party in the next parliament.
I think that's a very plausible analysis, because actually one of the implications of what you said, Maurice, was this term, which I don't really like, but I think does describe something real, the uniparty. That's to say, all the three major parties, and perhaps the nationalist parties as well, subscribe to the same model of how society should be ordered. It should be ordered through the administrative state and the market, and also through, increasingly through surveillance and the curbing of free speech under the guise of counter disinformation. I think this is a big new battleground which is opening up now.
And medicalisation
of everything.
Welfare.
Medicalisation of everything.
So there'd be an injection to make you thin,
And of course they interact, because if you say that any kind of unhappiness is a mental illness or a mental unhealth, and that not only pathologizes the person who suffers from it, but it also turns then into someone who can claim rights or benefits from suffering from this new type of illness. I mean, if all anxiety, I'm not saying there can't be pathological anxiety, I'm not even saying there isn't more of it around now than there was. I think there is more of it around than there was, partly because of COVID and social media and various new phenomena like that, identity theft and all the sorts of things that were much rarer or hardly happened at all before. But if every form of human limitation and suffering or even discomfort is medicalized, then everything being human is pathologized, but it also creates a kind of space for individuals to claim infinitely wider range of rights, to be rid of this condition, to be rid of the burden of being human, actually. That's one of the problems. I think, by the way, here, I would mention, since we're in Oxford, one of the greatest, actually seems to me possibly ever written, at least in English, analysis of this condition was given as a lecture in the Second World War by C.S. Lewis, and was published as a small pamphlet called The Abolition of Man. Urge you all to read it. You don't have to be practicing or believing Christian. You mentioned the Chinese Taoists and so on, but in analysing it. But he prophetically perceived this development and embodied it in one of his novels, That Hideous Strength, part of the three scientific knowledge of scientific technocracy, not so much of commoditized technology, but of scientific technocracy. That's to say, giving everyone what you assume everyone wants. But it turns out, to my mind, most of the population doesn't want most of the things that the technocrats want to give them. They have different values. The meaning of their lives is embodied in other things. And I think this is part of, get back to the Uniparty, this is part where I do agree very strongly with what Maurice is saying, and I think we should all think about it, which is that both major tendencies in British political life have been eviscerated in this way. And if there's no possibility of reviving these traditions in Labour, and if it's true, I don't think it's completely true, that within the Conservative Party there's no sense of the contradictions of Thatcherism. I think there is now, actually, among quite a lot of people, including even in the at least part of the leadership campaign. Then we are moving towards a situation of more comprehensive breakdown when a different party reform or a more general dissolution of the political system becomes not a fantasy or an apocalyptic myth, I think, but 4 years from now, with a completely hollowed out regime, maybe wars have gotten worse, maybe there's been a market crash, maybe there have been huge conflicts over immigration in Europe, now got North Korean troops on European soil. You know, symbolically, it might not mean much. I'm told by military experts, it might not mean all that much militarily in the war. Others will know more than me, but certainly symbolically interesting. But imagine if these kind of tendencies, perhaps impeded or accelerated, we don't know which, by a Trump administration, have gone further. Is it even conceivable that, in such a time of enormous volatility, that these three hollowed-out bits of the Uniparty will be able to maintain enough public support to keep the political system going? I suggest there's at least, I agree with you, that there is a realistic possibility they can't, so there'll be some sort of crisis.
Except,
will it be reformed, though, then?
No, except, strange thing for a Jew to say on a Jewish festival, but I believe in the resurrection. Mm-hmm. I do think that tonight I've been saying to conservative people that you've got to come to terms with the liberal market fantasy and reassert Oakeshott, civic institutions, the understanding of politics as a improvised activity, what Roger Scruton spoke a lot about, which was, a reassertion of the importance of place, of relationships, of the familiar. Those are the things that I tried to talk about tonight, obviously in relation to Labour, is the Labour tradition itself is perfectly poised to deal with this time.
Yeah.
So the enemy is just progressivism, and there's no.
Does it need greater crisis though before resurrection happens?
Yeah, I would say that the darkest hour comes right before the dawn. That's right. But don't imagine that there isn't a resonance of this politics in the working class, in the country, and also, to my surprise, in the recent intake in the parliamentary. Okay, so today I can proudly announce the first formation. Obviously, I was nothing to do with it, and I wasn't there. It was completely their own initiative. But there's now a blue Labour grouping in the Parliamentary Labour Party, which there was never before. On what is a post-Brexit foreign policy? How can we move into that space? For me, there's a huge possibility of this partnership with Ukraine. What I've discovered about Ukraine is not only that it still has a working class, it has extraordinarily range of precious metals that are necessary for contemporary industrial production, which we don't have. It also has it's an extremely fertile country. So Blue Labour is arguing for much closer union with Ukraine in this war. Trump is coming. By the way, try not to enjoy it too much when Trump wins the election in 2 weeks' time. Because obviously there is a delight about progressive hysteria. People, oh my God, it's the end of the world. But it is coming. I think that opens up space for Britain to lead both militarily and diplomatically in Europe. That's part of it. The pursuit of re-industrialization and industrial strategy. These are all things that are absolutely necessary. So this is the irony of it all. Do you know what Margaret Thatcher called her book? She called her book Statecraft. When her entire rule was the absolute obviation of the fundamental. Statecraft is about preserving a degree of national autonomy, protecting your liberty and democracy. The argument I'm making to you tonight is that this was all based on losing our autonomy, losing our self-sufficiency, absolute blindness to where we were investing, which was in Southeast Asian Communist Party generally and within the Chinese Communist Party in particular. But the fundamental pillars of conservative historical statecraft are the preservation of armed forces, with degrees of agricultural and industrial autonomy. Does anybody here remember COVID? Do you remember that, this period? I mean, it was shocking our palsy. We couldn't even make face masks. We were dependent to such a degree on Chinese manufacture. So,
John, we're more dependent now, actually, in many areas.
And
most of the so-called green technology is controlled by or produced by China.
Yep.
Solar energy and others. Most of the batteries use materials which come from parts of Africa and elsewhere, which are controlled by China.
But that's the incredible.
So they've got close to being a monopoly capitalist.
I mean, it could be worse. We could be Germany, and and this is just one of those stories that still I'm absorbing in my head, because one of the aspects of. So I've been to Ukraine 10 times, and since the war started, I'm really committed to building this alliance with Ukraine and supporting them in the resistance to Russian invasion and domination, which I view as a terrible form of darkness. And in all of that, it would make complete sense for Germany to there's a company called Motor-Sich, which makes advanced engines, perfect alliance with BMW or Volkswagen. There's Yuzmash, which is a kind of rocket building institute. But it's all of those. Germans are nowhere near it. It's just an incredible contemporary story of progressive hubris and complete. Is that Germany is an industrial power, and it's the leading industrial power in Western Europe, sure. So Thatcher destroyed a lot of it, but I hope you all understand that the very essence of industrial production is the generation of heat. This heat is the energy, the transformational power that turns things into other things. It's heat, right? That's fundamental. And so what did Germany do? It decided to abolish all forms of fossil fuel. Then it decided to abolish all forms of nuclear power. So the dirty thing, and it wasn't called out at all, except actually by Trump called it out, is that Germany was entirely dependent on Russian oil and gas for its continuity of industrial production. When that was cut off, it's entering into a complete disintegration of its political, industrial, and economic system.
Well, it was actively deindustrializing itself.
Yeah.
It's actually gone a long way since then. Well, since that happened, but I don't see that as a market driven project. It's actually a more almost a millenarian or an apocalyptic or a radical green project of a certain kind, which is. And we, in our own way, though, wouldn't you agree, Maurice? We've, in a way, done that. A bill was passed and it became law in Britain. I think there were only half a dozen dissenters in the whole of the Commons, which imposed certain certain targets which are completely unachievable, actually, or only at a cost which would be so enormous that it won't be sustainable. We've done the same thing without actually the technologies, the infrastructure, the raw materials, without anything that would make these targets achievable. They're the law of the land.
Yep.
So that's something which is coming closer and closer to, I think, the present Labour government, which might not be China, it might not be war in the Middle East, it might not even be Ukraine. It might be internally when keeping the lights on comes into conflict with these targets. What do they do then? Do you think they just back off?
They must. I mean, that's clear. So, they
have to sack certain people.
The great thing about politics is that reality does have a way of intruding on people's fantasy worlds. Yes. And, so, I mean, nuclear is absolutely primary objective, and we have to move into the space to re-industrialize for sure.
So let's just raise a couple of thoughts towards the end before we wrap it up. Is the unit for you whereby politics is rekindled in Britain, is it still Britain? Is it Britain as a nation state or a multinational state or
no?
It's Britain.
Yeah, definitely. So don't forget, everybody, that something quite remarkable happened in our country. Is that we voted to leave the European Union. Okay, this is still the source of my hope in resurrection. What we have is a ruling class that is still thinking like the bits of my paper that were very, very, or even more boring than the parts that I read were all about member state and looking for the approval of elites in other countries. So view it that we're at the beginning of a renewal of democratic self-government. That's essential. There's lots of work to be done in terms of foreign policy so I argue very strongly that we go all in with Kiev and forget about Paris and Berlin, that the European Union is in fact a toxic space of long-term disintegration, where basically politics is abolished, but you can't abolish politics. So what you're going to see is the AfD increasing its vote in Germany, the Sarah Wagenknecht alliance. What you're going to see is Le Pen winning the next elections in France. And believe me, the French are more serious than the Italians. Meloni is very much a postmodern fascist. I think Le Pen will give us more a taste of the real thing. And this will be going on. And compared to that, we're an oasis of stability in that regard. But that's a separate story going on but what we have to do is understand the direction of travel. That's the first aspect of statecraft. We have to renew state capacity. We have to move towards industrialization. We have to move towards alliances. The future is going to be bilateral rather than multilateral, industrial rather than financial. it's going to be based on invention rather than. I mean, we lived for 40 years where all you had to do was say the word innovation, and you'd receive innumerable government subsidies for whatever you were doing. I'm hoping that era is coming to an end, and we can actually show that we're doing something substantial. We're definitely this change of era is real and dramatic. State sovereignty, state partnership with industry, but also a massive move away from regulation. We've got to allow, genuinely allow markets to grow and flourish. This is so every aspect of the previous era, this era of liberal globalization, is proving to be false. But we at least have the capacity to restore ourselves. So my tentative thing, I said it in the paper, is I believe that the era ahead is the era of restoration. Restoration of the authority of Parliament, restoration of the armed forces, restoration of the monarchy, restoration of civic institutions. I don't know, the ones I worry most about are universities, which I think have utterly lost their sense of self-respect and civic autonomy and become much more subordinated to all of this. But even that can be restored. So we're moving to this era of restoration, and because we're outside the European Union, there is at least, we can only blame ourselves if we don't do it. This is the thing.
Thank you. If I can cite an American poet.
No, don't do it.
No, I'm going to cite an American. I'm going to do it. John Ashbery, in one of his great poems, he said, it's the present that is uncharted, not the future.
Yeah.
The key is to understand the present, and I think I've understood the present a lot better by listening to and talking with Maurice tonight than I can remember doing for a very long time. I hope we could all thank Maurice for stirring our thoughts in this way and helping us to understand the present.
Yeah. Thank you.